Chapter 6, Act 6, Alone, Again. Act 6, Alone, Again. Stop! A female voice cried out. To Cecil, it sounded like it was coming from miles and miles away. He felt an immense pressure lift from his chest and the sound of footsteps walking away. Hold on, Cecil, Edward whispered. He poured something hot and sticky down Cecil's throat. Cecil gagged and writhed around, instantly feeling like he was falling back into his body and recognizing the bitter taste of Phoenix down. Opening his eyes, Cecil could see Edward leaning over him. Yang was to his right, poised and ready to strike. God! My head! Cecil moaned, slowly sitting up. Where is Kane? Kane's back was to Cecil, and he was staring at the open doorway. Rosa and Rydia were standing there, Rydia holding onto Rosa's leg. There were no signs of any monsters or soldiers. In fact, everything was completely silent except for the sound of Cecil's labored breathing. Rosa! Kane lowered his lance. Kane! Rosa cried, running up to him and grabbing his face. Please, tell me you've not turned traitor. Erg! Don't! Look at me! Kane hissed, shoving Rosa to the floor and turning back to Cecil. I have business to finish. You'll do no such thing. Yang warned, taking a step forward, his arms outstretched. Kane twirled his lance in his fingers as he approached Cecil, raising the blade above his head and staring down at his bloodied best friend. Cecil cringed and closed his eyes, willing it to be over with. Kane, why ever do you hesitate? A dark shadow had blocked the light shining through the open doorway to the crystal chamber. The shadow drifted forward as if floating, and Cecil realized that it was a man. He had to have been at least 6.5 feet tall. He was clad in black armor from head to toe, the only thing on his body not black being the glowing yellow orbs that were shining from inside his helmet, like dragon's eyes. Upon the helmet protruded 2 grotesque black horns that nearly reached the ceiling. A black leather cape dragged on the floor as he walked in metal-cased, spiked boots, and yet his footsteps made no sound. Cecil could see that his gauntlets were lined with onyx, and the tips of his fingers were sharpened into sharp black points. Reaching out a long, claw-like hand, he made a gesture from Kane's lance down to Cecil, and snickered. He's right there, Kane. His voice was deep and calm, his pronunciations spoken with the air of an aristocrat, with just a hint of amusement laced in his words. A figure clad in armor of deepest night. You must be Golbez, the usurper, Cecil hissed. And you, Cecil, Golbez replied. I've been anxious to meet you. Let me give you something to remember me by. He raised his hand, which had begun to glow an ominous purple. Cecil! Edward cried. Let me through! Yang demanded, cutting in front of Cecil and raising his fists. Golbez shook his head and laughed. I did not come to deal with such foolishness, he hissed, and thrust his palm forward. An immense wave of dark energy washed over the entire room, knocking Yang and Edward to their knees. Cecil's head slammed back to the mirrored floor, suddenly feeling as if the gravity of the planet was trying to drag him down to hell. Rydia was frozen stiff, horror in her eyes as the men fell before her. Rosa was still on the floor, staring in shock. Only Kane and Golbez remained standing as the dark mist dissipated. Enough of this. Kane, bring me the crystal. Yes, my lord. Kane bowed his head slightly and turned, climbing up the staircase to the crystal pillar. Don't do it, Kane! Rosa suddenly cried, reaching her hand out toward him. Kane paused on the last step and looked over at Rosa, a grimace on his lips. Rosa, leave it be! Cecil moaned, dragging himself up from the floor. If Kane snapped and attacked Rosa, there would be no way she would survive it. Golbez looked over his shoulder at Rosa, and chuckled. Oh, so you care for this one, do you? Then let me take her along as well. To hold in trust until we are graced with the chance to meet again. Come, Kane. Golbez suddenly teleported to Rosa's side, gripping her upper arm within his claw and lifting her up from the floor, pulling her close to his chest. Rosa cried out and tried to jerk away, but his hand could fit completely around her and it kept her tight against him. Cecil! Rosa! Cecil moaned, struggling to rise onto his knees. But it was too late. Rosa hadn't finished her scream before she and Golbez disappeared in a flash of purple light. Cain snatched the crystal of air, tucking it under his arm and tilting his head toward Cecil as he leapt by.
It would seem your life has been spared. For now.
He turned away and leapt in the air, disappearing in a flash of light before reaching the ceiling.
Cain. Wait. Erg.
Cecil moaned and clenched his fist.
God damnit.
Rydia looked around and stepped up to the fallen men, raising her arms and calling cure. Blue, glittering light sprinkled over the fallen, and Cecil felt slightly revitalized. Edward stood up and aided Yang, but Cecil couldn't bring himself to rise yet.
Are you all right?
Rydia asked hesitantly.
Yes, thank you Rydia,
Edward replied, looking down.
But now they have Rosa. We could not even defend the crystal,
Yang muttered, slamming his fist against his hand.
Rosa?
Cecil whimpered. He couldn't believe it. She was really gone. She had just been standing there a second ago. Rydia stomped her foot and shook her head.
What's wrong with all of you? They took Rosa, but they didn't hurt her. We just need to rescue her. And we can get the crystal back too. She's right, of course,
Edward smiled slightly.
We can get everything back. And it is my turn to help you now, Cecil,
Yang offered gently.
Let us heal our wounds, and think of a way we might free Rosa. Thank you,
Cecil whispered, closing his eyes. He could feel a wave of nausea rolling over his consciousness. As he fell forward, a pair of strong arms caught him from hitting the floor.
La 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 la, 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 la la a. La, la la. Erg.
Cecil slowly opened his eyes and waited for his vision to come into focus. He was staring at the stone ceiling of the Fable Inn, which was of course within the castle. Edward was sitting on the windowsill of the room, playing his harp and singing along softly. When he noticed Cecil stirring, he stopped playing and came over to his bedside.
Cecil, are you finally awake? I suppose I am,
Cecil moaned, reaching up to feel where the throbbing in his head was coming from. It was wrapped tightly in bandages.
We're still in Fable, right? Yes, at the inn,
Edward replied.
You've been sleeping for 3 days. What?
Cecil cried, suddenly bolting upright and regretting it immediately as sharp pains shot down his spine.
Ah. Calm yourself,
Edward warned, pulling up some pillows so Cecil could lean back.
You took a severe beating in that crystal room. The castle medic said it was a wonder you survived at all. So you must be very careful. But 3 days have gone by,
Cecil cried.
Rosa could be. Surely, Rosa is fine,
Edward offered, a bit forcefully.
And at any rate, we needed to plan before we could find her anyway, right? Right, I guess,
Cecil sighed, sinking back against the pillows.
Are Yang and Rydia? I will fetch them, they are both doing well,
Edward said, forcing Cecil further down into the bed.
I'll be right back.
He turned and left the room. Cecil closed his eyes again and tried to calm himself. Edward may be right. No matter what Cain tried to do to me, he would never let Golbez harm Rosa. Her voice somehow reached him in the crystal chamber. As long as Rosa is with Cain, she'll be safe. Right? He couldn't believe that he had lost her again. But this time, things were different. He knew he could do something about her desert fever, he could bring her back from the brink then. But nobody knew Golbez. A Sand Ruby would not dissipate this threat. This was a man who thought nothing of murdering entire nations at a time. Cecil had encountered him. And barely survived. He would think nothing of destroying Rosa, if only to torture him, Cecil was quite sure of that. What he wasn't sure about was why Golbez hated him so much in the first place. After all, Golbez had been Cecil's successor to the Red Wings. How did he even know that Cecil existed?
Cecil, you are awake.
Yang smiled as he, Rydia and Edward walked into the room, shutting the door behind them.
Do you feel up to strategizing? Yes, I need to focus on something else,
Cecil sighed.
But I've already decided that if we have any hope of taking on Golbez, we'll need an airship. But the only man who knows how to build one lives in Baron, Sid Polendina. Is there no way we can enter the kingdom,
Yang asked.
Cecil, do you know if there is any way? The Red Wings comprise the brunt of Baron's power,
Cecil explained.
But Baron's maritime forces are relatively weak. If we do go, it will have to be by sea. How are we going to get a boat?
Rydia asked.
It has already been taken care of,
Yang said.
I have spoken with the king, and he understood that we would probably have need of travel when Cecil woke up. We have a boat secured at the harbor that is ready to leave whenever we are. However, he wanted to speak to us before we left. Thank you,
Cecil sighed.
With that out of the way, I suppose you want to know about what happened in the crystal chamber. Who was that dragoon?
Yang asked, getting right to the point.
He is, or was my best friend.
Cecil looked up at the ceiling, not believing the words that were coming out of his mouth.
We had sworn to fight Baron together after we escaped. But we got separated shortly after. This was the first I had seen of him. And Rosa knew him too?
Edward asked.
Yes, we three grew up together. I see.
Edward looked down.
He seemed to respond a bit to Rosa. Perhaps he is not too far gone. What do you mean?
Cecil asked.
Cain might have been being controlled by Golbez,
Yang explained.
I'm not sure, but that was the impression I was getting from his chi. His aura felt poisonous. Controlled or not? It was definitely Cain,
Cecil whispered.
That's all I can say for now.
He didn't want to admit it out loud, but he had a nagging feeling deep down that Cain might have plenty of other reasons to lash out at Cecil. After all, Cecil hadn't gone to look for him, had he? And in a way, they had always been rivals. Ever since they were children. It had just never turned this bad before. Rydia blanched as she saw the look of pain on Cecil's face.
Let's not talk about Cain, okay?
Suddenly, there was a sharp knock on the door, and a fat bull monk in training stepped in.
Master Yang,
he said, bowing immediately as an apology for his intrusion.
Sir, your wife has been asking for you. Of course, thank you,
Yang replied, standing up.
Shall we go meet her? Your wife?
Cecil asked, blinking. Yang was married?
Yes, her name is Sheila,
Yang replied, amused at the look of surprise on Cecil's face.
I am sorry I neglected to mention her earlier. I have not seen her since we returned from Mount Hobbs though, so if I do not see her before we depart, I'm afraid she may get, well, a little violent.
He chuckled, although Cecil wasn't sure if he was telling a joke or not.
She wants to meet everyone who fought with Master Yang in the battle.
The monk explained.
So you too, Master Cecil.
With that, he turned and walked away.
I can understand you not wanting to leave bed, but my wife does make an amazing fried chocobo egg.
Yang smiled.
And we will need our strength before we go. No, I'll come, of course,
Cecil said, slowly pushing his blankets off and swinging his legs to the floor. He was still in his armor and he felt sweaty and disgusting. He had never gone so long without taking it off. They followed Yang out of the inn and all the way to the top of a twisting tower in the east wing of the castle. Before they had even reached the doorway to Yang's quarters, the door swung open and a tall woman stood before them, with violet hair tucked in a bun so messy most of the hair was out of it rather than in. She had a full face with a smooth, tan complexion, and one of the more ample busts Cecil had ever seen pouring out of a yellow peasant top. Under her purple skirts, she was barefooted. Her grey eyes narrowed as she took in the scene in front of her, her fingers curling tighter around the broom in her hand.
Hello, honey.
Yang said cheerfully, leaning in for a kiss. The woman pulled back and immediately swung at Yang's head with her broom, missing narrowly.
Yang!
She bellowed, her face turning red.
Where have you been? I've been worried sick. I know dear, I'm sorry.
Yang smiled, poking his head in again to steal a quick kiss as she turned and walked away into their quarters, muttering and putting her broom up against a wall. Cecil, Edward, and Rydia stared at Yang as he laughed and followed her in.
That must be Sheila,
Edward said quietly, and they went in too.
So, the king must have been keeping you busy if you haven't come home for 3 days,
Sheila said as she went over to a whistling tea kettle on a stove and busied herself with it. Her tone had completely gone back to normal, like she didn't just try to decapitate Yang with a broom.
Yes, I'm afraid morale has been down quite a bit, not to mention there were many injuries,
Yang replied, gesturing for Cecil and the others to sit down at the table. Cecil pulled out a chair and sat nervously as Yang took a stack of plates and began to distribute them around the table. Sheila began to pour mugs of hot tea for each guest.
I am just glad you are all right,
Sheila said.
Although I see the Dark Knight here took a couple of knocks to the head. Thanks to these brave people.
Yang smiled, and Sheila bowed.
They saved me in Fabul. You all have my eternal gratitude,
Sheila smiled. She looked much less scary when she did that.
And you are unhurt, right?
Yang countered anxiously.
Of course.
Sheila laughed and waved her hand as if to dismiss the notion.
Whose wife do you think I am? A couple of soldiers tried to bust in here, but I busted them back out with my frying pan.
After setting the tea kettle down, she pulled a frying pan off the stove and began to scrape fried eggs onto each plate.
But I hear you are going on the road again.
She reached up, flicking a tear away from her eye, and scraped the last of the eggs onto Yang's plate, replacing the frying pan on the stove. Yang stood up from his chair and embraced her tightly from behind.
I'll be back before you know it,
he said.
This is something that I need to do. But in the meantime, I need you to watch over Fabul for me. Who the hell do you think you're talking to?
Sheila sniffled, shoving him away and waving him off again.
Now, eat up, all of you. We can say our goodbyes when you go to the harbor.
Cecil took a big bite of eggs and kept his eyes on his food throughout the entire exchange. Anna and Edward, Yang and Sheila, Rydia and Mist. I won't let Golbez take anything else away from these people. After lunch, Sheila insisted that she fuss over Rydia while the men spoke to the king.
Such a tiny girl!
Sheila exclaimed as Yang, Cecil, and Edward made their leave.
Absolutely no reason for you to be going along with them, dear. Clearly between the three of them, they can't even keep you from looking like a hooligan.
She pulled out a hairbrush and tried to run it through Rydia's ratty curls, which made her squirm in her chair and let out a whimper.
Ma'am, I must go,
Rydia protested.
I'm the only summoner they have.
Yang chuckled and closed the door behind them.
You wouldn't know it from a first glance, but Sheila has amazing maternal instincts,
Yang said.
She's going to make a fine mother someday. Yes, I'm sure,
Edward replied, looking away and pretending something fascinating was on the ceiling.
I find that Sheila and I balance each other out accordingly,
Yang added.
Really, there is no finer woman in Fabul. What did the king want to talk to us about?
Cecil asked, hoping for a change of subject.
I imagine he wants to advise us before we go to Baron,
Yang said.
Also, he said he had something for you, Cecil. Hey.
Cecil didn't quite know what to say to that. When they reached the king's bedroom, they were announced by the monk guarding the way before being let inside. Yang, Cecil, and Edward walked in the spacious room, plush carpeting sinking under their boots. The king was sitting up in a gigantic four-poster bed, the queen sitting next to him and reading from a book. The curtains over the window beside the bed had been drawn back, and sunlight poured into the room. The queen closed the book as they lined up beside the bed, smiling and nodding to them. Yang, Cecil, and Edward took a bow before King Fabul spoke. Despite the bandaged wounds that could be seen on the king's chest and arms, he spoke heartily and without hesitation for breath.
Your ship has been made ready for you. Yang, I expect you to aid these men in any way that you can.
He then turned to Cecil and bowed his head slightly.
There are no words of gratitude for such a sacrifice as you have made, young Lord of Baron. You defended my people selflessly, and I heard you lost Lady Rosa because of it.
The queen stood up, taking a package wrapped in brown paper from a dresser and handing it to Cecil as the king spoke.
What is this, your highness?
Cecil questioned, taking the package from the queen. It felt quite heavy.
Open it, young lord,
the queen replied, and Cecil pulled at the strings holding the brown paper together. As it fell away, a sturdy black blade was revealed. The hilt was a fine silver and encrusted with glittering sapphires and rubies. As Cecil twisted the sword in the sunlight, he could make out the words from an ancient language inscribed in a delicate script on the side of the blade. However, he had no idea what they read.
I want you to have this sword,
King Fabul explained.
It belonged to a dark knight that once visited these lands. Consider it my thanks for all of your valiant efforts in the defense of my kingdom. I believe the Dark Knight once called it the Deathbringer. Your Highness.
Cecil trailed off. It was truly a magnificent blade, that much he could see. As he tilted it slightly, he could see purple being reflected in the darkness of the blade from the sunlight.
But I give you this with a warning,
King Fabul said, lowering his tone and staring directly at Cecil.
A dark sword will never avail you against true evil. It is, after all, a weapon of darkness.
Cecil looked away from the sword and looked down at the king. The comment shook something inside his core that he didn't like the feeling of. He briefly thought back to his struggle to use the dark blade in his previous battle. Maybe the darkness was transforming him, for the worse.
Beyond this sword, you must rely on the inner strength you already have inside of you,
the king continued, leaning back and closing his eyes, a wave of exhaustion coming over him.
Please. Stop Golbez. My liege,
the queen said softly, reaching up with a damp cloth and dabbing it on the king's forehead.
Do not waste your energy worrying, dear. They will be all right.
The king groaned and sank back deeper into the bed.
Should Golbez obtain all the crystals, this world will face catastrophe such as it has never known. I trust you will not let that happen. We will not fail, your highness.
Yang said, bowing deeply.
We will make our departure now. Rest easy, for we will return victorious. Be well soon, your highness,
Edward said.
Thank you,
Cecil finally managed to say, sheathing the blade and turning away, the king's warning heavy on his heart. It had been something he had been realizing slowly on his own, knowing that the darkness was putting more stress on his body and becoming easier to summon and yet harder to execute. Like his body and his soul were at odds.
Have a blessed journey,
the queen said, and turned back to her husband. Yang led the others out of the chambers and the monk closed the doors behind them.
Let us go to the harbor,
Yang said.
I'm sure Sheila and Rydia are waiting for us by this point.
Cecil pulled his helmet on over his head as they approached the docks. Fabul's finest vessel was awaiting their arrival, with the crew scrambling all over the ship for any last-minute preparations before they took off. It was the perfect day to be at sea, with just a light wind fluttering through the sails and the sun banishing all the clouds. Sheila was standing at the edge of the dock with Rydia, who looked much more coiffed but somehow more worn down because of it. She waved to the men as they came over, and Sheila put her hands on her hips.
All I'll say is that you had best be careful and make me proud,
she demanded.
Show them what you're mad of. I will,
Yang smiled.
You too, Cecil,
Sheila said.
Of course,
Cecil replied.
I trust you'll handle things here while I'm away,
Yang said, and leaned in, giving Sheila a kiss on the forehead.
Of course,
Sheila replied.
Just take care of yourself.
Rydia gave Sheila a quick hug before running over to the sanctuary of a party which she knew contained no hairbrushes on their person.
Bye.
Edward smiled, and everyone waved as they boarded the ship. The captain approached Cecil and introduced himself, asking if Cecil was ready to go. Cecil nodded, and the captain gave the order to ship out.
Aye, Captain.
The crew shouted in unison, and everyone began to take their places. The ship started to slowly inch away from the harbor. Sheila remained at the edge of the dock and kept waving until the ship had pulled away and was long out of sight. After the excitement of the departure, the captain approached the group again and slapped his hands together.
No worries, men. We'll be laying anchor in Baron before ye know it. The weather is fine and the wind is in our favor. Should only be a couple of hours, I reckon. If you need anything, you know where to find me. Thank you,
Yang said, and the captain left to resume his post. They stood together, making sure everyone else was out of earshot before talking. At this point, Cecil suspected that even Fabulian sailors could be spies for Golbez. He hated this feeling of paranoia that had come over him, but any optimism that he might have once harbored was beaten out of him by Cain.
So, what do you mean to do when we reach Baron?
Yang asked.
First we must find Sid, the man I told you about,
Cecil said.
He's an engineer, and he's the one who created all the airships. He lives in town, but he spends a lot of his time at the castle. Let us hope he is still safe then,
Yang replied, and Cecil nodded. Rydia looked over at Edward, who was pursing his lips together and shaking quietly.
Are you cold?
Rydia asked softly.
You're shivering. No, it's nothing.
Edward shook his head. Indeed, it wasn't very cold at all, despite them being on the sea, and Edward was covered in the layers of Damscion's finest royal garb. Rydia tugged on his cape, not accepting his first reply.
Then, what is wrong? I just feel strange, sorry,
Edward said, and laughed weakly.
You'll just laugh at me, but I am getting the same feeling I got right before Golbez attacked Damscion. I think I am just seasick.
Edward shook his head and walked away. Rydia, Yang, and Cecil looked at each other.
We forget that Edward is perhaps a bit more delicate,
Yang offered slowly. Cecil wasn't sure what to say to that. Rydia was about to protest when the ship began to shake so violently that several sailors stumbled and fell to the floor at once.
Whoa!
Cecil cried, bracing himself against the edge of the ship.
What the hell is that?
A loud roar came from the waters beneath them, and the ship took another sharp heave as a sailor shouted from the crow's nest above.
It's him. Who?
Rydia cried, clinging to Yang's leg. Yang was managing to balance on his own and Edward had taken refuge on a post.
Impossible. The tales are true.
Another sailor cried.
It's the Lord of all waters. Who is the Lord of all waters?
Cecil yelled.
Leviathan.
The captain cried. The ship shook again, and the crew members began to run around, panicking. Cecil could make a dark figure slowly rising out of the ocean beside the ship. It looked like it was half snake and half dragon, a light blue scaly creature that had ruby red eyes that were focused directly on the ship. Its large maw opened, and an ear-piercing cry rang out over them.
Don't stand about!
The captain shouted from his post.
Reef the sails, you witless dogs!
Cecil watched as Leviathan swam towards the ship, ramming its head and body into it. Rydia let out a scream as the attack made her lose her grip on Yang. The ship rocked back from the impact of the waves and Rydia slipped and stumbled overboard.
Ahhhhhhhhhh!
Rydia screamed, reaching out as she plunged into the ocean below, only yards away from Leviathan.
Rydia!
Yang cried, kicking off his shoes and immediately diving in after her.
No!
Cecil cried, clutching to the edge of the ship as he watched Yang slice into the water. Something was happening near Leviathan's tail. A whirlpool was forming.
Rydia, Yang!
Leviathan seemed to be ignoring them for now, concentrating its energies on the ship and giving it another body slam.
Ah!
Edward cried. He was thrown from the post he had been clinging onto and was inches away from the edge of the ship. Cecil braced himself and as the ship swayed back from the impact, sprinted over to Edward and threw his body on top of him, locking his legs around the post and trying to drag him back from the edge. Sailors screamed as they were knocked from the posts and fell into the choppy waters below. The whirlpool was growing larger by the second, and Leviathan had slithered over to the other side of the ship, as if to guide it into the swirling waters. Cecil closed his eyes and clung onto Edward with all of his might. He could feel Edward sobbing from underneath him. The winds were picking up now, whipping by so hard that Cecil couldn't even hear the roar of the monster. With another shuddering crash, Leviathan threw itself against the ship again. There was a loud crack and wood, and a sailor came plummeting down from the crow's nest above Cecil's legs. Cecil could hear the sickening crack of bones breaking a few feet beside him, but before he could turn to see what was going on, a heavy piece of wood came crashing down upon his head, and everything went black.
Cecil!
He was watching as she paced back and forth, a small worry line forming on her forehead as she bit her lower lip. She was wearing a lavender gown that hung off her shoulders, her chest and neck exposed save for the diamond pendant hanging above her breasts. The gown swept back and forth as she turned and crossed the room again, her feet bare against the wooden floors.
She was absolutely furious,
Rosa explained, lacing her fingers together as if in prayer.
Even more so when I told her I was doing it because of her.
Cecil frowned and tapped his foot against the base of the bed he had been sitting on. They were inside a bedroom of the Baron Inn. Cecil had been sitting at the inn bar with Kane when Rosa came bursting in, tears in her eyes as she spotted Cecil and ran to him. She was such a mess that he couldn't very well leave her to sob in front of the other patrons. Kane politely turned away and started speaking with a fellow dragoon as Cecil pulled Rosa into an empty room and shut the door.
Rosa, I think your mother is concerned for that very reason,
Cecil explained.
Well, she watched your father die in battle. She doesn't want you to go through that same heartbreak. But I want to be beside you.
Rosa cried, sitting down next to Cecil and taking his hands.
I want to be strong enough to protect the people I love no matter what. Is that so wrong? No. Of course not,
Cecil sighed, leaning in and resting his head on hers.
Rosa. You are talented in white magic, and your mother knows it. The king knows too, that is why you train among the best white mages in the castle. But I feel that she must think you are too willing to throw your life and your potential away on the battlefield. She probably has been expecting you to just stay at the castle and become a respectable healer. I am going wherever you go,
Rosa sniffled.
I can fend for myself. But soon I will start going on really dangerous missions,
Cecil tried to explain.
That is the path of a dark knight. As soon as my training is completed this summer, I'll be with the Red Wings as a cadet. The Red Wings do not take mages with them on their missions for a reason, you know.
He sighed and shook his head.
Don't try to come with me on any of the missions. We'll both just get in trouble and your mother will never let us see each other again. Is that what you want? Cecil.
Rosa trailed off and pulled away from him, rubbing her wet eyes.
You say that? But do you really care if we ever see each other again? It doesn't seem like it. I tell you that I told my mother I want to be by your side and this is how you react.
Cecil was growing frustrated, thanks to the jumbling confusion of what was going on in his heart versus what was coming out of his mouth, and because he was a little drunk.
I just want what is best for you. Oh, really?
Rosa rolled her eyes and stood up, stepping into her purple flats and storming out of the room, slamming the door behind her. A few moments later Kane stepped in sheepishly, trying really hard not to grin as he sat beside Cecil.
Trouble with the old ball and chain, eh? I don't understand girls,
Cecil mumbled, falling back on the bed.
And I need another drink. I agree.
Kane grinned, pulling Cecil's arm over his shoulder and hauling him up from the bed.
Just let Rosa cool off for a while. You know how emotional she can get. She's probably just worried that you're going to meet some hot dancer babe while you're with the Red Wings and that she'll have to settle for me instead. Ha,
Cecil shook his head.
I am trying to do the right thing. Trying to have the proper courtship. Her mother hates me enough as it is. She has to know that I want to be with her too, right? It will be okay,
Kane said assuredly.
But in case you haven't figured it out yet, Rosa doesn't like to play by the rules. Just like you.
Cecil laughed unnecessarily loud.
Let's get another round of Bacchus wine, shall we? Ka. Ka. Ugh.
Cecil opened his eyes. He could see nothing but grey before him. He shut eyes again. It had been a dream. Or rather, a memory from his 16th summer. It had been the summer that Cecil had completed his training as a Dark Knight, and had been invited to join the Red Wings on a trial basis as a cadet. Kane had already been accepted as a member of the Dragoons, and was quickly rising in the ranks. Rosa had told her mother her intentions to fight on the battlefield with Cecil, and all hell broke loose. The rest of the summer and Cecil's first mission with the Red Wings and come and gone without speaking to Rosa. He found out later that she had allowed her mother to send her to a high-end magic academy in Mycedia for vigorous training and to keep her far away from Cecil. The year Cecil turned 18 was the year he became captain of the Red Wings, and it was the year that Rosa had arrived back home in Baron via the Devil's Road, an ancient magical pathway that could teleport travelers from the town of Mycedia to Baron in mere minutes. Cecil knew the night Rosa was arriving home thanks to the rumor-mongering of the castle mages. He had waited for her to appear at the road's gates anxiously, holding a bundle of letters with a leather strap around them. As she stepped through the gatehouse, their eyes met and all Cecil could manage was sheepishly handing her the letters.
I wrote one to you every day. That I did not hear your voice.
Cecil opened his eyes again, before he could let himself get lost in his head anymore. The greyness he had seen before was the sky overhead, which was full of clouds that seemed to be rushing to the west.
Caw.
A seagull swooped down just over Cecil's head, causing him to panic and sit up straight. He was on a beach, just feet away from the morning tide that was rushing in and out. The pungent odor of salt mixed with sweat filled his nostrils, and he realized the smell was coming from him. Opening the visor on his helmet, he breathed in the fresh ocean air and slowly stood up. He had survived Leviathan's attack on the ship. However, the ship, and everyone else, was nowhere to be found. There was nothing washed up on the beach, not even a slab of wood. Cecil started to walk forward, away from the ocean, calling out the names of the others.
Rydia. Yang. Edward. Rydia. Yang. Edward.
After a half hour of walking and calling out, Cecil had wandered away from the beach and onto a dusty road that wound through a grassland. Looking ahead, he could see that the road eventually ended at a small town that was in the distance. Cecil sighed and finally gave in, letting the coldness that had been creeping into his chest finally swoop in and take hold of his soul.
I guess I'm alone.
End of chapter. Chapter end.